Thank you all for coming today. Welcome to our third Voices Not Forgotten event. Today, we have the extreme pleasure of speaking with Mr. George Nakata, who is representing himself, but the Japanese American Museum of Oregon is the new name, I believe, of the organization. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking to you from Vancouver iTech Preparatory and the ancestral lands of the Cowlitz tribe. Before we get going today, I also want to thank Mr. Nakata and the Japanese American Museum for helping us with today's event. I would be remiss if I don't thank my fellow colleagues, Dr. Aaron Lark, David Midkiff, Brad Lehman, Tom Wolverton, Aaron Weintraub, and Angela Lindsay for their help putting this event together today. So without any further ado, I'm going to turn the event over to Mr. Nakata, and we will hear about his experiences as an internee in a Japanese concentration camp. I believe it was Camp Minidoka, if I'm correct.
Yes.
All right. So thank you, Mr. Nakata. The floor is yours.
Well, good morning. It's certainly my pleasure to be with you here at the Vancouver Tech Preparatory and share with you some of my history and experiences. You know, recently all of us have heard of racial injustice. We've heard of diversity. We've heard of immigrants. And indeed, we have tried to examine America itself a little bit more deeply. When we reflect back on our US history, your and my history, it really becomes a beginning of the story of immigrants. America is a country of immigrants, unless you're the indigenous Native American. You have all come, that is your grandparents, great-grandparents have come from someplace. And that's what makes America, its diversity, its differences, its various cultures, all blended together. When you listen to the events of today, it is nothing new. It is something that has been in our history throughout and has been accentuated in recent days. Think for a moment about America as a country. If you were to go to China, everybody there would be Chinese. That's obvious. If you go to Russia, everybody is Russian. France, everybody is French. You go to Korea, everybody is Korean. Well, what's the point of that? Well, the point of that is when you come to America, it is very unique. We are different cultures, different religion, different people. We eat different food. We are a harmony of different cultures, of different people, of different societies. And so when we take an interlook at ourselves, we see something a bit different. You see a hyphen that says Japanese American, Chinese American, Muslim American, Jewish American, Black American. Very unique in the 100, 200 different countries that we have in this world of ours. So when we look at Japanese Americans, we look at a group of people that came from the little island country of Japan here in the late 1890s and early 1900s. They were the first generation, which we call the Issei, the first generation. They arrived here in the land of freedom, in the land of liberty. They knew very well our Declaration of Independence, a document that our founding fathers created that says in part that all men are created equal. That all men are created equal, and yet, in all candor, if we examine our own history, racial injustice, or put it this way, racial justice, has not always been present in this great land called America. So as we start to look at the facts, let's start with the Declaration of Independence. That document was signed by 56 signatories, 56. of which 41 owned slaves. Think of that for a moment. The beginning of this country, racial injustice. Most of the signatures owning slaves. Think of our history for a moment. America. Think of the indigenous people, the Native Americans. They are the true Native Americans. At the beginning, there were some 562 different tribes. And then what did we do? We took the land away from them. We took the land away from our founders. And then as you progress in American history, slavery existed. Not today. It's kind of hard for you to imagine. But there were thousands of slaves brought here from Africa in the 16th, 17th century. They were bought, they were sold, they were owned. Until, of course, the Emancipation Proclamation, which eventually freed the remaining 3 million slaves. Think for a moment about the Chinese that came to America. You know, in the 1840s, there's something called the California Gold Rush. The Chinese were excellent miners. They were instrumental in the successful California Gold Rush. America, as a young country, was trying to connect the East and the West. The Transcontinental Railroad. 20,000 Chinese worked on that railroad. They were very, very key to connecting America in of itself, the Chinese. And yet, what did we do in appreciation to the work of the pioneering Chinese? In 1892 or 1882, they passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. We don't want any more Chinese into America. That's our history. Dark chapters in our chapter of injustice, racial injustice. It's hard for us to admit. And then what happened to the Japanese? I, being Japanese American, can share with you that with the coming of World War II, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt signed an executive order that had a number to it, 9066. It simply targeted one race, Japanese Americans. We think of President Abraham Lincoln, President Theodore Roosevelt, President Franklin Roosevelt as great presidents. He did many great things. But FDR also did some terrible things. And one was considering Japanese Americans as enemy aliens and putting them behind barbed wires, 120,000 of them. I happen to be one of them. Yes, America was very careless with its own constitution. I learned as a very young age that freedom is very, very fragile. You know, when I was in Eastern Oregon a year and a half ago, I had the pleasure of meeting with the Umatilla tribe, indigenous people, fine people. They have a great big reservation back there and into the state of Washington. Thousands of members of the Umatilla tribe. And one of the elders happened to turn to me during the conversation. He says, you know, my people have been here for 10,000 years. I thought about that statement. Imagine for a moment, white Americans from Europe have been here how long in Oregon? 100 years, 150, 200 years? The indigenous people, the Native Americans, have been here for 10,000 years. We should respect that. We should. Take the first Naturalization Act, 1792. America passed its very first Naturalization Act. In order to be a citizen of this great country of ours, you had to be two things. You had to be white and you had to be free. People of color residing in this great nation couldn't even dream of being a citizen of this country. The 1792 Naturalization Act. The West Coast of America, here in Oregon, we never had a Statue of Liberty like they did on the East Coast. Statue of Liberty, a great statue with the torch in one hand, enlightening, welcoming you to America, a book, a tablet on the other hand, with 1776 thereon. Statue of Liberty. No Statue of Liberty on the West Coast. But the Asians came, Japanese came all along the West Coast, and they were not welcomed. The white Americans did not like the Japanese. We were hated. We were called many names. The fifth column, the yellow terror. Life was not pleasant. I, as a young boy, remember very well many, many incidents. To go downtown in out of Japantown, to one of the stores in Fifth Avenue or Fourth Avenue, and oftentimes being called a dirty Jap. That really hurts. It leaves a lasting memory even on a young child. That was Portland, way back when. Japan and the United States during the 1930s, 1940s had a very strained relationship. America even had a list of 1,370 Japanese on the West Coast, a list that they said they may be dangerous, they may be spies. Totally wrong. I looked at that list after World War II. My doctor was on the list, my dentist, people that owned a little shop, a floral shop, a grocery store, fine, upstanding, law-abiding people. And they had them, because they were Japanese, on a hit list. America. I want you to know that racial injustice prevailed throughout our history, and we should understand that a little bit better. December 7th of 1941, the beginning of World War II. Most of you don't understand the World War. I'm not talking about a police action. I'm not talking about just Vietnam, the Korean War, the Gulf War. I'm talking about the entire world at war. That was 1942. And many people in America faulted Japanese. We were not treated equally. We came here as a country of choice, leaving the country of birth. And yet that Executive Order 9066, signed on February the 19th of 1942, and authorized General John DeWitt to do away or get rid of these Japs. We targeted, America targeted Japanese and Japanese Americans. So that spring of 42, our family lost everything. I don't think any of you would understand that. That simple statement, losing everything. Have you ever lost your home? Lost all your belongings? Lost your family albums, your photographs, memorabilia, things that are part of your life, and you lose it all? Has that ever happened to you? That happened to 120,000 Japanese in the spring of 1942. We lost everything. My father, an immigrant, worked hard. He bought a 1936 Ford pickup. He lost that. My mother wept as she got rid of her silk kimono. My sister Mary cried and cried as she got rid of everything. I lost my toys, my books, my school papers, everything. We were incarcerated, imprisoned into what's now the Expo Center, at that time called the Portland Assembly Center. It was horse stalls, chicken coops, but good enough for those Japs. Surrounded by barbed wires and armed guards, 3,676 of us incarcerated in this maze of plywood. I remember going into our compartment of 14 by 14, 4 army cots, canvas bag. We ordered to take that canvas bag into the center. At the center, there was an arena with a big pile of hay. Stuff that hay into these canvas bags because that will serve as your mattress. Those were the days. You make your own mattress. You're a prisoner of war. In the English language, that's called euphemism. Taking something and making it sound more gentle, more tame. The Portland Assembly Center, not really. It was a barbed wire barn. It was a prisoner. It was a prison. And the prisoners were Japanese and Japanese Americans. We stayed there the entire summer of 1942, and then we found ourselves aboard trains, a train destined to where we don't know. Have you ever taken a trip where you don't know where you're going or how long you're going to be there? That is stress. And we rode that train all night, and suddenly we detrain, get off, and somebody says we're in Idaho. I've never been in Idaho, had no idea. We're aboard buses and taken 19.5 miles northeast of a place called Twin Falls into the sea of wilderness, sagebrush. That's all it is, wild sagebrush. And a sea of barracks, tar-papered black barracks, hundreds of them, 44 blocks with each block with 12 barracks, each barrack with 6 units from A to F. My family had a family number, 15066. We were imprisoned in block number 34, barrack number 6, apartment A, 34-6A, that's my unit. Again, 4 army cots, a pot-belly stove, a few lumps of coal. I had to feed that coal in the wintertime into the stove. It was my job as a young boy to clean out the ashes twice a day. I remember that barrack. I remember our unit. I remember 34-6A, my family number 15066, like it was yesterday. That was how Japanese were treated. It was a most difficult time. Why was that? We had committed no crime. We had no trial. We had no due process. America is very proud of its freedom, its liberties, and yet denied those very fundamental rights to citizens like me. It was extremely difficult. A difficult life, trying to exist, lining up in a mess hall, eating whatever they gave you, starting your own school. We had a high school and grade school. We had good teachers, and they taught us. We lacked books. Thank goodness for the Red Cross and the Quakers. They sent us some books so we can continue our education. Education is very important to the Japanese culture. And inside barbed wire fences, inside concentration camps, we continued our education. I remember pledging allegiance to the American flag and looking out through the window at the barbed wire and the guard stations. Life in a concentration camp. It was difficult. I remember Christmas time when the mess halls would try to decorate itself with some semblance of the Yuletide spirit. Not easy. What can you use? Sagebrush, tar paper? But somehow they converted these kitchens, these dining rooms, these mess halls into winter wonderland. A touch of Christmas. As a young boy, I remember going around the camp, looking at the different mess halls. They had a mini contest to see which mess hall could decorate itself the best. And as I went around the camp, I saw on a window a banner with a gold star. I asked my friend, what is that? Well, don't you know, the family that lives in that unit, they lost a son fighting for America. Sobering. I went on and saw a banner with 2 gold stars, and yes, the family that lived in that unit, they lost 2 sons fighting for America. For you see, in 1943, the American government decided to take volunteers from these 10 concentration camps. These young Japanese Americans, they'll probably make good soldiers. Yes, we did. We formed the 442nd, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. They trained in Fort Shelby, Mississippi. They went on to fight in North Africa, Italy, France, and Germany. They had heavy casualty. This was the unit that rescued the lost Texas Battalion. This was the one that freed Dachau, the Jewish camp. The record of the 442nd is beyond reproach. 9,486 Purple Heart, 21 Medal of Honor, the most highly decorated unit in U.S. military Army history. Not to be mentioned, but it was the 442nd, made entirely of U.S. Japanese Americans. Many of them giving the supreme sacrifice while their mothers and fathers were incarcerated in concentration camps back here in America. I can tell you many stories about World War II. It was a most difficult time, but it was a time of racial injustice at its greatest, when these thousands of Japanese Americans were not only incarcerated, but were stripped of their freedom and their liberties. It was a most difficult period of my life spent behind barbed wire fences. It was a time when France and Germany and Italy, Dachau, the very, very difficult times in Europe. And then, of course, August of 1945, something called the atomic bomb. Yes, the atomic bomb. It was the nuclear weapon at that time, dropped on a country called Japan in a city called Hiroshima. 3 days later, onto a city called Nagasaki, and 250,000 people died or remained for life. People don't talk about that too often, do they? I went to Japan many times in my international trade career. I visited Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I personally met people, victims, maimed for life. Yes, those are difficult times during World War II, but the war suddenly ends and we come back to Portland, the city of roses, place of my birth, the place where my mother and father pulled up their roots in Japan and came and settled down here. Their country of choice, their city of choice, Portland, Oregon. Now there is no Japantown. There's no, the Willamette River to 6th Avenue, Ankeny Street, and those stores, those little bathhouse, candy shops, fish market, very familiar, 3rd Avenue, 2nd Avenue. I used to roller skate in Japantown, but there's no Japantown. It was a different Portland. We started life all over again. We had nothing. We lost everything. We went out to a place called St. John's, to a housing project. We picked berries and picked beans for our very survival. I went to a Goodwill store to buy some clothes so that I would look halfway decent going back to school. And I went back to school to James John Grade School on Lombard Street. And when I entered, the school teacher, immediately I could tell that she hated Japanese. She looked at me and said, "Sit in the back." Not at a desk, but at a table. I sat there and I looked forward. I saw a girl in the front desk opening up her pocket purse and pulling out this small pocket mirror. She was looking back at me. Apparently, she'd never seen a Japanese before. Many years ago, indelible memories. Memories that to this day, I can't ever forget. James John School, a girl looking back at me in her pocket mirror. We studied hard. We got good grades. My sister went to Roosevelt High School. Then we moved back down to downtown Portland. Attended Lincoln High School. Did well. Got some scholarship offers. Not easy, but Lincoln was different. Lincoln was where, before World War II, the Japanese Americans went. They went to Cooch School and Shattuck School and then went on to Lincoln High School. So Lincoln High School was used to having Asians. And when you talk about racial injustice, Lincoln High School, if you were to pick a school, understood the diversity and racial differences of different cultures. So I ended up graduating from Lincoln High School and went on to graduate from Lewis and Clark College. Good times. Good times. Then came 1982. The US Congress put together a commission to look back on what happened in 1942, the incarceration of Japanese Americans and putting them into concentration camps. They had many hundreds of interviews, and they came out with their findings. That action by American government in 42 against the Japanese was totally wrong. Totally wrong because it was based on racial prejudice. It was based on the hysteria of war, and it was based on the lack of political leadership. Yes, America made major mistakes. And so 1988, President Bush sent to us a letter of apology. I still have that letter. I showed it to my children and my grandchildren. How many times in American history has our government had the sheer guts to apologize and admit that they made a major, major racial mistake? They did. They admitted. I'm reminded of our Constitution, the preamble. You know, it starts with "we the people," doesn't it? We the people. What does that mean? We the people. Does it mean we the white people? Really? Does it mean we the indivisible, undivided nation? Does it mean all the people? Those with hyphens? Black Americans? Hispanic Americans? Maybe Japanese Americans? Is that what we the people means? I believe that our founding fathers, that is what it meant. It meant all the people, we the people. And so when I'm reminded of our Constitution, I'm reminded of the Statue of Liberty. Yes, the torch. Yes, the tablet. But at the foot of the Statue of Liberty, which is very hard to see when you go there are broken chains and broken shackles. How many of you knew that? People don't talk about that. Broken chains and broken shackles at the foot of the Statue of Liberty, which means the ending of slavery, the ending of treating marginalized people like they're second-class citizens, equality. That's what that means. Yes. And the poem, the little poem on the bottom of the Statue of Liberty, how many people, it collects dust. You can hardly read it. But in the middle of that short poem, it says simply, "Give me your tired, give me your poor, give me your huddled masses so that they can breathe freely." That line in that little poem speaks of America. Yes. I'm reminded of what America is all about through a simple poem that appears on the bottom of the Statue of Liberty. One can go on. This great land of ours called America, first settled for the first many hundreds of years by the indigenous. Let's respect the true Native Americans. Let's respect the immigrants that have come here, whether they came here from Latin America, from Eastern Europe, from Southeast Asia, from Korea, Japan, China, Taiwan, from Hungary and Bulgaria, from Russia, from Africa. They're all Americans. They are the people that built America, because this great land of ours called America, it was made by the indigenous. It was built by the poor, made by the tired, the blacks, the Europeans, the immigrants, the Muslim Americans, the Jewish Americans, and yes, by Japanese Americans too. That's who built America. So when you take that phrase that you've heard recently called racial injustice, I wanted to share these thoughts with you today so that you can perhaps have a little different dimension of what racial injustice is all about. We've had racial injustice here in America. I lived through it, but I remain a very proud American. I'm very proud of this country. There's no other country like it. I've traveled in Asia over 100 times because of my business. I lived in Europe as a soldier. I traveled throughout Europe. I have been to Israel. I have been to Poland. I have been to Scandinavia. I have been to Stuttgart, Germany. So with that luxury of travel, I've seen different cultures, different economies, different people. There is no country that comes close to America. A lot of us Americans should be thankful, and with greater thanks, with greater depth, and with greater understanding of what we have here in this great land of ours called America. Thank you for letting me share these thoughts with you. I'm not sure of the technical mechanics here, of whether I'm able to field questions or not, but that's what I wanted to share with you this morning. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much,
Mr. Nakata.
Mr. Nakata.
We do have some questions from the students and some things that we would like to ask you if you have some time here. One of our first questions is, would Korean people be mistreated too during the war?
Well, Korea has a very unique history, as you know. It was divided, North Korea, South Korea. The economies, very, very different. So when you speak of Korea, we are, of course, as Americans, more familiar with South Korea. And South Korea, being a neighbor of Japan, participated in the economy of the post-World War II period. They were able to rebuild. And I remember going there in the early 1950s. It was a devastated, crushed country. Seoul, Korea was flattened out. It was terrible to witness and see that. But going back in the 1980s, 1990s, you see an energetic people that built and rebuilt its country. When you go there today and you go to Incheon and you go to Seoul and you go to Korea, it is a rebuilt country and participating in the new economy of today's world. And so it has recovered and recovered fully. And so Korea has experienced very, very dark times. But it's to their credit and to the credit of the Korean people that they have built up a country that is important to Asia and important to the world today.
Thank you. One question is, one of our sixth graders is wondering why you weren't really allowed to grab your stuff or bring a lot of things with you when you were told to pack up your house.
Well, those were part of the what they call exclusion and evacuation orders. Put it very simply, we could only bring that which we could carry. And as a little boy, I couldn't carry very much. My parents are not big in stature. They couldn't carry very much. And it's a very simple question for you to ask me, and a logical one. Well, why didn't you leave your things with your neighbors? Let me repeat. I lived in Japantown. We're all Japanese. My neighbor to my left, to my right, in front, and behind, above, we're all Japanese. We're all being imprisoned. I had no neighbors to leave anything with. They were also being imprisoned. And so we had no option. We had nobody to leave things with. We could only bring that which we could carry. That was the reality. Cruel, yes. America, it seems out of character. But America at that time hated Japanese. You have to understand that. We were a race that was totally disrespected and disregarded, marginalized and hated. And we could only bring that which we could carry, and that's the reason.
Did the Japanese government ever find out about the camps that the United States had? And did they ever try to do anything to speak up for the Japanese Americans?
Yes and no, meaning they were well aware. They were very well aware of all the camps, the 10 camps, whether it's Heart Mountain, Wyoming, Manzanar, California, Postum, Minidoka. They were well aware. They were well aware of the conditions, the barbed wire, the guards, armed guards, the stripping of freedom, losing all of our family possessions. They understood that very well. At the same time, Japan was at war with America. Well, as was Italy and it was Germany. It was a world war. And most of the people listening to this program have never witnessed a world war. That was the entire world at war. And those were the times of the 1940s. And Japan was over there in Asia. It had finished the war with China, with Russia. Japan, in its long history, Americans don't understand our own history. America is a very young country, 100, 200 years old. Step back for a moment and realize that countries in Asia and Europe are thousands of years old. Imagine that just for a moment. Japan had a Russo-Japanese war. It was a war with big China. You know, over there in Europe, there's been wars going on in Austria. Austria is not the Austria today. It's a huge empire. We don't understand a lot of that history. Americans have shallow history. I hate to say that to fellow Americans, but that's the truth. And so Japanese, yes, they know their history books very, very well. They know what happened to other Japanese Americans, their relatives, their grandchildren, their offsprings, as they immigrated and left Japan and came to America and ended up in concentration camps. The answer is yes, they knew it very well. The second is no, they could not do anything about it when you're at war or following the World War. They couldn't do anything about it. So those are the answers.
Did Asian Americans imprisoned ever get their money and their things back?
The answer is no. My father, who had the hotel and 2 markets on Columbia Boulevard, 3 businesses, he lost it all. He sold his Ford pickup, which he sold for $35. Give you an example. When we rushed and were incarcerated, we had a General Electric radio that my parents bought in 1939 for $100. As a simple example, they sold it to a policeman on the beat for $5. Just one single example of the financial hardships. So we lost everything. I can multiply that radio by 100 different things. All of our possessions we lost. We lost 3 businesses, never to be gained. When we came back from camp, we worked as migrant workers. I picked berries and picked beans for our survival. So please understand, we lost everything. We didn't regain anything. We started life anew. Many people in America really don't understand that. Imagine for a moment, you only have the clothes that you have on yourself right now. That's it. Nothing from your home. Walk away and go to Minidoka, Idaho, behind barbed wires and spend the next 4 years there. And come back, and nothing that you left is here for you. Very hard for you to imagine that. That's the situation we were in.
Do you see any parallels from your experience during the war to some of the things happening in our society recently, specifically towards Asian Americans or other people of color?
Well, of course, yes and no. There's discrimination and prejudice that unfortunately continues on. White Europeans are very comfortable, for the most part, with other white Europeans. Do they really understand the culture of the blacks, of Asians? Are they really used to eating with chopsticks? Really? They're very familiar with mashed potatoes, aren't they? But are they familiar with rice? Really? It's more of a novelty, isn't it? To go to a Chinese restaurant or have something called sushi. It's a trendy thing to do. But there is a very fundamental lack of understanding. And so there are parallels, yes. There's some understanding, yes. But there are major differences. There are major challenges. What's happening in the southern borders of Texas, Arizona, California? The people from Guatemala, Honduras, Mexico, that are trying to enter the United States. People tell me, well, George, isn't that exactly what happened to you? No. Do those people from Guatemala have a family number? Do those people from Honduras, were they removed from their homes? No. They came on volunteer caravans up to the border on their own volition, and they entered the United States. We were taken from our homes. We were stripped of our possessions. We were given a family number. Very different. But people don't realize that. We were stripped of our freedom, of our liberties. I'm not saying that it's very easy for those folks from Guatemala, but what I'm saying is conditions were very, very different. And a lot of Americans don't realize how different they were. Today, there is no world war going on. There's no war. We're talking about a time when the Japanese Americans were incarcerated because of a world war, and Japan was our enemy. Please realize those fundamental differences that are going on today that do not exist back today as they did back then.
You've referenced the Constitution several times in your talk today. How do you think when and you said that we the people includes everyone. So how can we as a country try to really include everyone and move forward to really have that be the definition that you believe in?
Well, I recognize the enormity or the huge challenge that it is. As I mentioned earlier, when you go to China, everybody's Chinese. When you go to Russia, everybody's Russian. Here you have Chinese Americans, you have Russian Americans, and 100 other different cultures, behavior patterns, the food that they eat, the language that they speak. How do you, as a nation, become colorblind? How do you become understanding of someone that has a different religion? It is very, very challenging. But tolerance and understanding are words. Have we truly practiced it 100%? Every day when you go out, you go to downtown Portland, you go to a store, or younger people go to school, and they see a fellow student that may be a person of color. Do they try to really understand them? What home do they go to? Do they eat meat and potatoes like you? Do they eat with a fork? Some countries eat with their fingers. Can you identify that country? You know, effort to understand each other better. I think we would be headed in the right direction.
Well, thank you so very much, Mr. Nakata. We are right at the end of our time today. I know I'm getting lots of thanks from students that are working online, and we do greatly appreciate you sharing your story. I know that it must bring back a lot of painful memories for you, but we really appreciate you sharing your history with us and your voice. Personally, I believe that if we don't hear sometimes these hard truths and these hard histories, we can't learn from the mistakes of the past. And so from all of us here at iTech, we do greatly appreciate your time with us today.
Let me just say thank you. Not all schools, I've gone to a number of schools, but Vancouver iTech, I appreciate your interest. I appreciate your listening to me. I would like to tell my story to other societies and other people and other schools. You've shown the interest. This is my second time coming to your group. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for joining us today for our Voices Not Forgotten event. Earlier today, we got to hear from Mr. George Nakata, who was interned and incarcerated at the Minidoka concentration camp in the United States. Today, this afternoon, we have the pleasure of hearing from Clarice Wilsey. And her story is about World War II as well, but about the Holocaust in Europe and her story with her father. So without any further ado, I give to you Miss Wilsey.
Thank you so much, everybody associated with iTech. I just am very grateful that all of you have made a commitment to instructing, helping students to learn more about, making them more aware of the Holocaust, the horrors of what happened during World War II. And I have a story that I want to tell you, an experience of my father's, and I'm very grateful for all the teachers, administration. What I want to do is I want to talk about mystery, surprise, atrocities, and hope. And if we don't have hope, we're sunk. I mean, hope is so important. And we all know that there's all kinds of things that are going on today with racism, anti-Semitism. And one of the important things that all the Holocaust museums in the country and the world say is never again and never forget. And I'm going to tell you about my father's experience. In World War II, he was in the Battle of the Bulge. He was also in Dachau. My emphasis is going to be Dachau concentration camp. He was a medical doctor. He was a physician in the 116th Evacuation Hospital. And they went from location to location to location. Real quick, I'm going to explain the hospital. First, there was the front lines, and they had litter bearers. And those people would bring the people in who were wounded, take them, give them a shot of morphine, take their name, their ID tag, then send them to a field hospital for whatever. And if the person needed surgery, then they went to the evacuation hospital. And my father was an anesthesiologist and performed anesthesia. So basically, what I'm going to talk about is a journey of words, though rarely spoken. Next, please. Shall I just keep going?
Yes, I'm having some problems with the slides.
Okay. Oh, no problem. That's just fine. So I'm going to talk about a journey of words. And this is my father's experience in Germany and France. And in fact, I didn't even know he was in France until after we discovered the letters, which I'm going to tell you about. My brother and my sister and I grew up in Spokane, Washington. We knew just a little bit about our father and his war experience. We knew a teeny bit about the fact that he'd been in Dachau concentration camp as a physician, one of 27 physicians, helping the 40,000 people that were left, many of whom were close to death, many of whom were able to survive. And my father and his medical team helped those who could survive to do so. We knew little about what happened. We knew nothing about the fact that there were a box of letters. And those letters were hidden deep in the attic for 70 years. In 2009, we were cleaning out the family home to sell it. And we were in a great hurry, had no idea what was there. So the mystery is these letters. So somewhere in Germany, the letters went from Dachau, Battle of the Bulge, wherever he was, to Bismarck, North Dakota, where his wife, my late mother later, lived with my infant brother's son. They had been stationed in Massachusetts at Fort Devens. My brother had a heart disease, so they moved to Minneapolis. My father then, Bismarck, North Dakota. She stayed with her parents. And then after the war, my father taught at the University of Minnesota Medical School, and then they moved to Spokane, Washington. And what's amazing, in those two moves, in the second house, there was a house fire. And what an amazing thing that those letters still existed. They did not get burned. They did not get scorched. It was just amazing, these letters, but we had no clue that they were there. Now the PowerPoint was just on, and now it's gone again.
I'm having some technical issues. I apologize.
That's fine. That's fine. I'll just keep going, okay? And I think what I'll do is I'll just tell you when I want a new slide, and if you can do that, that's great, okay? So, my father was a man of words. He loved words. And I'm going to start out by telling you some of the words he wrote in one of the letters. And these words are what have called me to speak about his experience, to share his story to one and all, and to help students, adults, to really think about and understand exactly what happened for one person during the Holocaust. So this letter is written June 1st, 1945. And I want to say that I'm going to read the letters exactly the way he wrote them, because I think it's really important for you to know exactly what he said. And I also don't want to miss any words. So here's what he wrote as I read it. On June 1st, 1945, which was about 5 weeks after they had arrived in Dachau at Liberation, which was April 29th, 1945. Please, darling, don't feel you have to rant on paper about Dachau. I know you see and know it for what it is, and that's all I care, all I ask, is that you instill it into as many thousand others as you can, till maybe we can get millions to see it. That was his desire. He implored my mother, his wife, to talk about Dachau and what he saw. In many letters, he said something very similar. But yet, when he came home, he couldn't talk about it. So as I've read these letters, and I've read that letter and several others about telling thousands so that millions will know, that has become my mission at this point and caused me to retire from the University of Oregon after 20 years so I could pursue this full time. So back to my father loving words. Well, I'm going to tell you kind of a funny story. And my neighbor, or their neighbor, our neighbor, used to say that my dad was so verbal that if you asked him what time it was, he would give you a description of the history of the clock. So when you think about that, and you think about the fact he was so silent during his years, it really is deafening for that. So next slide, please, the dictionary.
I'm having issues with the whole slideshow, please. I'm sorry. I'll make sure it gets included later on.
No, don't worry at all. Okay, so imagine a large Webster's Unabridged Dictionary on a coffee table, and you're a kid, and you ask your dad what a word means, and he goes, "Look it up," and I'm like, "What?" So here I am, I'm a kid, I don't know how to spell the word necessarily, and most likely I don't know how to spell the word. Once in a while, he'd give us a hint. Then, not only once we looked it up, we had to use that word in a sentence to understand what it meant. Well, can you imagine a kid, how much fun that was? But I use this as an example to show about the huge contrast between his inability to talk about his experience at Dachau and his love of words. So there he is. The only time he would actually talk about the Holocaust was if somebody on the news said, the Holocaust did not exist. Well, he would stand up, he would start yelling at the TV, he would say, I was there, I know it happened, and then, I won't repeat, he let off a string of swear words to let the TV know what he thought about the Nazis. Well, then we thought, well, that might be an opening. So we'd say, well, Dad, blah, blah, whatever, ask him a question. And he would either say very firmly, you don't need to know about this, or he would just give us kind of a not very nice look. And we knew to end the questioning and end of the subject. So let me read to you another letter about that indicates his descriptiveness, his love of words that he sent to our mother. Now, granted, sorry, I keep saying our mother, but she wasn't our mother at that point. So my mother was a physical therapist at Warm Springs, Georgia, which was the physical rehabilitation location for President Roosevelt that he started because he had polio. And many of you may know about the fact that he had polio when he was president. Well, she was invited to be one of the physical therapists there. So she had the opportunity to meet President Roosevelt. And a really fun thing was that she used to get to drive his car, his hand-controlled car, into town. Now, today, you know that that would never have happened. She was also there when Pearl Harbor happened, and she wrote her parents and said, I'm so worried about President Roosevelt. He looks so exhausted and so tired. I'm so worried about him. Well, and that was a few days before Pearl Harbor, so you can imagine how exhausted he was. So here's the letter my dad wrote when he learned about President Roosevelt dying. I felt for you on Friday, April 13th, 1945, when I learned of Roosevelt's dying. At that moment, we were certainly far from anyone on a high crest of half mountainous nature, sort of awesome nature. It's hard to describe my feelings, but the hugeness of world death geography all swooped up into one awesome, horrible, yet beautiful manner in one gulp at me. So keep in mind the fact that he just wouldn't talk about it. So my part of the journey begins when I'm 6 years old. So I won't tell you how old I am, but it was quite a few years ago, okay? So I'm 6 years old. We moved from one house in Spokane to another. And that was the house that eventually we had a fire, actually about 6 months to a year later. And I was in the dining room unpacking boxes, trying to help. Well, I probably was told to help. And I opened this box and I found all these absolutely ugly pictures of Holocaust victims, dead bodies, corpses, pictures that many of you probably have seen in a history book. Well, being that I was 6 years old, I had never even seen a pet die. So I really didn't understand what death was all about. So my curiosity said to my dad, "Dad, what are these pictures?" He got angry. He grabbed them out of my hand and he disappeared. Now, I never forgot those pictures, but nothing was said from that year until 2009, when I'm going to tell you an amazing journey that happened. Okay, the next picture, if you could see it, is a picture of the United States Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. Some of you may have been there, some of you may have not, but I would encourage you to Google United States Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. It's the primary Holocaust center in this country and perhaps in the world, other than Yad Vashem, which is in Jerusalem, Israel. So I'm in Washington, D.C. for a conference for the University of Oregon, my job, and I hear the conductor say, "Next stop, Holocaust Museum." And I'm thinking, next picture, please. Okay, so I'm saying, so the conductor, so I'm thinking, my dad was at Dachau, but I really don't know anything about it. So I thought, well, I'm going to get off the bus and go to the museum. So I went to the elevator. There were 3 elevators, maybe 50 people in one elevator. And the man in the front of the elevator said to me, I was at the other elevator, I said, "Do you want to get in the front of the line?" So think about the amazing coincidence that he offered me to get in front of the line. We go up to the 4th floor. This is a goosebump story. We go to the 4th floor and the doors open up in the elevator, and across the way is a film of my dad walking past 2 former prisoners. Well, mind you, I didn't know my dad when he was 30 years old. So my memory is of an older man, but I knew that it was my father, the way he walked, the way he looked, his facial features. And I'm standing there and I'm just shocked. And had I not been at the front of the elevator, I probably would have moved on because there was such a crowd of people between the elevator door and the wall where his picture was. I started shaking. I cannot tell you how. I mean, I was shaking, I was nervous. I mean, the whole thing. So there I am saying to myself, oh my gosh, this is another piece of proof that my father was at Dachau, and he is now pictured in a film. And one of the letters will be interesting for you because I'm going to talk about that. So May 8th, 1945 is another letter. Why? The horror is so unbelievable that they flew congressmen to see it the day we came. That famous Washington, D.C. woman correspondent was with us this noon to see it. Ambassador Caffrey to France saw it today. General Eisenhower, as you know, became President Eisenhower, is expected any minute. My father ended up in another letter saying that he had dinner with General Eisenhower, who is the commander. All Europe's biggest cabinet. He repeatedly tells my mom to look at Time magazine, April 1945. I found the magazine on eBay. At the time, it was like 30 cents. I paid much, much more for that today, but I'm so glad I have it. And then he says, "Look for me in a newsreel," he continued. "To think that this is only the Queen Bee camp. Others are worse, though much smaller, and it is here that the policies were worked out for the lesser camps. In fact, Dachau is the home of Bestiality Heinrich Himmler Laboratory and Hangout. So just a little brief explanation. Dachau was the first camp built in March of 1933. It was in an old munitions factory. Heinrich Himmler was the architect of all of the Holocaust camps, but this was the first one. So this was where he, as my father said, hung out. And one of the things we learned later in letters was that he actually was able to take a hot shower for the first time in 7 months in Heinrich Himmler's headquarters. Okay, so when that happened, I called my mom. I was so excited. I told my siblings. When I was in Spokane, I told anybody who would listen. But my mother only said, "That's interesting," which really puzzled me, but I didn't understand that until later when the letters were discovered. So the reality of my father saying, "Look for me in a newsreel," happened at the United States Holocaust Memorial. Okay, next, please. Okay, the next picture you're going to see is a box of letters that we had no idea existed. And I keep telling you that because it's such an amazing story for me and how this all happened. So in 2009, we were selling our parents' house. My mom had died in 2008, my father again in 1996. So my brother, my sister, and I came from different corners of the country to clear out the house. And mind you, I had never forgotten those horrible pictures, though I never told anybody about it. And as we were packing and sorting, I kept looking for them. And eventually I thought, well, he must have just gotten rid of those pictures. Well, we were in such a hurry to get those pictures, to get the house sold because the buyers were moving in, that we just ended up taking the information out of the trunk, the boxes, what have you, not paying attention for any sentimentality or looking through any boxes. There just wasn't enough time. So we shoved all the boxes into random cars, vans, trucks. And that was July of 2009. In October of 2009, living in Eugene, Oregon, I thought, I wonder what is in some of these boxes. Well, much, much, much to my surprise, and this is where surprise comes in, I opened the first box, and there in the middle of that box were the letters. And then this box, they were in pristine chronological condition. And within the middle of that box were those horrible pictures. Now, unfortunately, I didn't take a picture of the box when I first opened it. I was too overwhelmed by that. And so now they've been kind of moved and looked through and the pictures are gone. But it gives you an idea. Almost every day, sometimes twice a day, he would write my mother and he would describe in great, great detail. Now, I knew that the liberation of Dachau was somewhere the end of April. So I kind of went through the letters. And the first letter, this is the first letter I pulled out and I read. And imagine not knowing anything about this until this moment. And this is the first letter that I read. We roared through the gates of Dachau, figuratively minutes after its liberation, while 40,000 wrecks of humanity milled, tore, looted, screamed, and cried like depraved beasts which the Nazi SS had made them. In those early minutes, I saw captured SS against a wall and then shot in what you Americans would call cold blood. But Emily, my mother's name, God forgive me if I say I saw it done without a single disturbed emotion, because they so had it coming to them after what I had just seen and what every minute more I have been seeing of the SS beast's actions. So he was not an unfeeling person, but he was so horrified at what he saw that he thought, boy, these people really need to die. I mean, it was just so horrific. Okay, the picture on the right, I believe is a periscope that one would use on the front lines to see the enemy in a far distance, but I don't know that for sure. So if anybody in the audience happens to know exactly what it is, I know it's German because there's German writing on it. The box says David's from overseas. That's my grandfather's writing, and that was the box that was kept. Okay, so next slide, please. Okay, the next slide is going to talk a little bit about my father's history. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about my dad in the 116th Evacuation Hospital. My father was part of General George Patton's army, which many of you may have studied. And when they arrived, they saw the horrors as I've just described. The Rainbow Division was the infantry that came in. As they got closer and closer, the smell was horrible because there were thousands of people in like a dozen cattle cars, all piled up. There was human waste. There was the death and the dying, the smell of that. And the Rainbow Division was absolutely horrified. In my dad's letters, many of them vomited, some of them fainted. And I think this is what contributed and propelled them to start shooting randomly when they walked in and they saw what they saw. And maybe later, some of you can talk about what would you have done if you'd been in that situation? Would you have shot people? Would you have stopped? What do you think you might have done? My father writes about the crying, the yelling for joy, the hugging, the excitement, when they burst through the doors of the concentration camp. I should say the gate of the concentration camp. When the survivors saw the soldiers, they started yelling, "Americans, Americans, Americans." They were so excited, and you see them waving their hats. The picture on the right, maybe some of you have heard of Iwo Jima. To me, that's sort of an Iwo Jima picture because Iwo Jima, they raised the American flag at the top of Iwo Jima. But it's the idea of all these prisoners, former prisoners, survivors, soldiers, raising the American flag and taking down the Nazi flag, the swastika. Can you imagine the joy that those survivors had when they saw that flag go up and the other nasty, nasty flag go down? So next picture is a map of Germany. Now, I don't know about you, but I never knew where Dachau was until I started working on this. Now, I knew it was in Germany, but to be very specific, it was about 30 miles from Munich, which is a very large city. Actually, it's a beautiful city. And it was in the town of Dachau. And Dachau, the town, was known for its beautiful, lovely lighting. And so many, many artists would come to Dachau to paint because of the lighting. And I'm sure a weather person would be able to explain why, but I cannot. So they moved into this munitions camp. Now, one of the really horrible things about this is that at the liberation, the people in the town denied that they knew anything was happening. Oh no, we don't know anything that's happening. Oh no, everything's just fine. Well, let's face it, there were hundreds of guards who would go into the town, buy their toothpaste, buy wine, buy cheese, go to dinner. Well, who are all these people? I would think they'd wonder, but they didn't say anything. The other was there was a smell, again, not to be blunt, there was a smell, terrible smell. And then the chimney, dust was coming out, ashes were coming out of the chimney quite frequently. So what was coming out of the chimney? Well, we all know now it was the gas chambers of the people who had been killed. Okay, next, please. So I want to read another letter, and this is Victory in Europe, which is May 8th. And I don't think he really knew it was May 8th, because when you think about it, there were not text phones, cell phones, there weren't any of that sort of thing. So I think it took a while for the word to get out. And here is the letter. Emily, we are sweating, stinking, existing in the hell on earth, Dachau. Let every word of January or December Reader's Digest bore through the middle of your guts and multiply 100-fold. The atrocity reports are true and more. For over 8 days, I've seen, lived, smelled, existed it as one of 27 doctors to try to correct the medical horror component of the hell on earth. He capitalizes the whole thing. Bodies starved to 50 pounds, men piled like rotting cordwood, huge gas chambers built like shower rooms as a ruse, hangman scaffolds, rotting, cremating ovens for dead, dying, or still unconscious skin and bones, wrecks of humanity. Stepping high as you walk to work over dead bodies in the street, stormtroopers, the SS, riot prisoners, and man-eating Doberman Pinscher dogs all riding. I want to remind you that my father was a very compassionate man. So seeing all of this had to just be horrific for him. So when he talks about what happened to the prisoners, he's not being insensitive, he's being horrified. Horrified, horrified. Okay, so the famous gate to Dachau says Arbeit macht frei. Some of you may know that in German, this says the work will set you free. This is the entrance where all the prisoners came from the cattle cars or whatever into the camp. Well, work sets you free, that's pretty much of a joke. I mean, it's not even a joke. It's pretty much of an untruth when you think about what happened once they got in the doors. When his 27 physicians went in, there were probably 40,000 people there left. When the Rainbow Division went in, there were about the same. However, the Rainbow Division probably left, 24, 48 hours. But my dad's medical team, those 27 physicians and any nurses, med techs that they might have had, stayed for 5 weeks, and they were locked in because they didn't want anybody to leave because of typhus, typhoid, TB. There were virulent diseases. There was a lot of hunger. People hadn't had showers in months and perhaps years. So, it was really a horrific scene. Most likely, there were many, many more than 188,000 people that were killed. That's somewhat of a number, but one will never know completely because the Nazis, as they were, the Allies were coming in, the Russians and the Americans, they started destroying records. So it's very hard to know exactly what the statistics are. So next slide, please. Millions of words have been written about the Holocaust, about Dachau, by military people, historians, survivors, for libraries, for research centers, millions of words. So I'm just talking about one person's experience. But if you haven't yet, I hope you will read some of what's been written about this. And I emphasize my father's letters, not the research that's been done, which is wonderful and accurate and really, really important. But this is the experience of one man talking about what he saw and how he experienced this. Okay, here is another letter. And my father used the word Holocaust quite frequently. And 5 years ago, a professor from Duke University was contacted about my dad and his experience and about my dad using the word Holocaust. And the professor said, I'm really surprised he used the word Holocaust because it was not a popular common word at that time. But maybe in his intelligence, his brilliance, I don't know what, but he was using the word Holocaust frequently. So here is a compilation of letters. We are in the nightmarish Holocaust, he wrote on March 23rd, 1945. So about 5 weeks before they arrived at Dachau. The 116th Evacuation Hospital moved across France and Germany behind the advancing lines. Gosh, darling, a guy just wonders how many times the world is going to ask, or the Holocaust misses to be gone through. Each one seems like the last straw, and yet more and more come. He never really said how many or how often or which ones, but they came upon a number of them. Shockingly, I discovered there were 4,000 Holocaust camps, concentration camps in Europe and Africa. Okay, then 2 days later, March 25th, Holocaust after Holocaust, all followed by exclamation points. It's just wearing me out. I'm exhausted. On April 20th, 9 days before they arrived, as the 116th Evacuation Hospital approaches Dachau and rumors circulate what might be found there, he wrote, "We are the only evac hospital within 100 miles of this horrible Holocaust." Oh my gosh. But preliminary reports, at least indicate it might well be that in all caps, nightmarish Holocaust all over again from the same site. Excuse me, I need a drink of water. Okay, so.
And Clarice, I just want to say, we've got about 15 minutes left, just so you know.
Okay, well, I'm almost done. Okay, go to the next. Okay, let's just skip this slide and we'll go to the next. Okay, do we have 15 minutes to question or do we have just 15 minutes?
15 minutes.
Okay.
Or what? Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. So on the left of this picture, the arrow is my father. It's another picture of him in the typhus ward. And then, let's see. Why don't you go to the next slide? Okay, these are some what I call symbols of war. A Bronze Star he got for doing 5,000 anesthesias in the front lines in the Holocaust. The Red Cross armband that was supposed to be used to prevent people from getting shot if they wore it, but that never happened or didn't always happen. On the right is the Dachau concentration camp that said he was a permanent member of the concentration camp. So when I first saw that, I just was sick. Okay, 3 things that people have asked me when I've given talks, and I've given over 60 at this point. Have you been to Dachau? Have you written a book? Do you have a website? So next slide, please. So on October 11th, 2018, friends and I walked into Dachau concentration camp. And there aren't really words for me to explain. On the upper left, in Yiddish, English, French, German, and Russian, it says never again. And that's one of the most important messages from all the museums, as I said earlier, is never again and never forget. To the right, looking out the exhibition hall, which is where the pictures were, and that picture of my dad with the arrow on it, this is a statue, a sculpture, I should say, of emaciated bodies. You can't really tell from this picture, but it is very powerful. And then lower left, as you may know, the Jewish people had to wear yellow stars. The many other types of people, political dissidents, intellectuals, etc., had to wear different color stars. And that's a statue of that. And then on the right is the tomb of the unknown Holocaust victim. And on the squares of the box, it says in each language, never again. So it was an amazing experience. So next slide, just really quick. And then the next slide. This is my book. I finally got it done. And in about 3 weeks, my website's going to be finished. And then the next slide, please. So this is a picture of me and my dad. And when I read these letters, I was overwhelmed. I cannot tell you the emotion I had, and the fact that I never could ask him or my mother or anybody any questions. But I am called to be his voice, and I want to be able to share with each of you the fact that yes, the Holocaust did exist. If you hear somebody say it didn't, please tell them, you know, a lady came to your class and she documented that. I ask you to do something. You're the leaders of tomorrow. You're the leaders of today. And I pray and hope that each of you will take a stand about some important situation, whether it be homeless, food security or insecurity, animals, what have you. Take a stand, get involved. Because I am going to be eventually at my retirement home playing bingo, and I'm not going to be able to be doing this anymore. So I'm hoping that you will be out there making a difference, just even in the small sphere corner of your world. You don't have to go thousands of miles. You can if you want. But think about what's important to you that you could get behind. So you could be like me, feeling a calling to do this. So thank you all very much. I really appreciate your listening. And John, Mr. Zangali, is there any time for questions?
Yeah, let me do a couple things here. So if you have any questions that would like to be asked, you can type them into the Q&A, or if you're in my classroom, you can kind of like let me know what they are. But and I have some from another document. I'm just gonna reopen real quick here. All right. There we are. So, did your father ever publish anything, such as the book, or what? Did you just have those collection of letters?
My father absolutely never told us there were letters. Our mother never told us there were letters. He never talked about it. So that's why I published a book in the honor of what he experienced, because he never, ever talked about it, except those times I told you when he'd yell at the TV and say that the Holocaust, counter the fact they said the Holocaust didn't exist. The letters also are published, archived at the Holocaust Museum in Seattle, and they're archived under the word Wilsey Collection, W-I-L, S as in Susan, E-Y collection. So those are his actual letters, photocopied and archived. So you'll see his writing, you'll see the actual words if you choose to go there.
Where is your family from? Where was he from and living before he was stationed in Europe?
My dad grew up in Oconomowoc, Wisconsin, a small town between Madison, Wisconsin and Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He went to the University of Wisconsin undergrad and medical school. My mother was a physical therapy major at University of Wisconsin, which is where they met. Then they moved to Elko, Nevada, where he was in a private practice in a clinic. And then at that time, they heard about the fact that they needed doctors in the war. And he and my mom, after a year of marriage, decided that it was really important for him to join the Army and be part of the medical corps. And then they were stationed in Fort Devens, Massachusetts. That's where my brother was born, and that's where he deployed from to Europe. And then they ended up in Minneapolis and Spokane.
Why do you think, or the other question is, did your father sign up to fight in the war, or was he drafted?
No. He and my mother decided that because they needed physicians, he would sign up. He wasn't asked, but they knew from whatever news probably how many doctors they needed. So he and my mom said, yes, it's really important for you to go. So no draft.
How do you think seeing all of this impacted his life when he returned back to the United States?
It impacted him significantly. And I talk about that in the book. One of the slides you didn't see, he wrote to my mom, "War changes things, you'll just have to see for yourself." And to be totally blunt, you've all heard about PTSD, and my father did have PTSD. But in my talks, I don't want to emphasize that right now because he still was a very dedicated doctor and he was so committed to what he was doing, but it did have a lasting impact on him.
Well, that seems to be a trend with not only people like your father, but others that experience these types of traumas, even like Mr. Nakata. So many people don't want to talk about it because they have to relive it.
Exactly.
But, you know,
and so
that's why I think for a long time, people didn't tell these stories because it was so traumatic.
Well, can I add to that? So in World War II, the soldiers came home, they were heroes. Well, how is a hero supposed to come home? Everybody celebrated, "Oh, you're so wonderful, you vanquished Hitler." And how can they say, "Oh, I'm really messed up, I'm depressed, I'm upset, I've seen these horrible things"? I can't do that. I have to be a hero. And what they do is they internalize it, they swallow it, and then it comes out in forms of PTSD. And of course, back then, they didn't know what PTSD was. It was Vietnam that helped to recognize that.
When does the book come out again, Clarice?
Actually, a year ago last week.
Okay, so it's out already.
Yeah, it's right in the middle of the pandemic. The name of the book is Letters from Dachau, A Father's Witness of War, A Daughter's Dream of Peace.
I'll work on sending that out. We're getting some students that are
that's great.
In that, so.
Right.
And then lastly, do you see anything in the recent events that our country has kind of gone through in the last several years? Any lessons that we can learn from the Holocaust that might apply to today?
Do you see what I'm doing? I'm hitting my head. Absolutely, absolutely. There is so much this is my opinion. There is so much racism. There is so much anti-Semitism. We have Asian hate happening right now. We have intolerance. We have indifference. We have bigotry. We have hate. We also have some really wonderful people. We have some wonderful people that are helping with the COVID. We have wonderful young people who are getting turkeys for people at Thanksgiving. There are wonderful young people who are doing all kinds of wonderful things. And that's why I say to you, do something that is significant and important to you in the corner of your life to help take a stand against the intolerance, the indifference. And I don't ever, ever, ever want to equate Hitler with bullying, but think about how bullying impacts somebody in middle school, high school, college, and it escalates. So take a stand. If you see somebody being bullied, either stop the bully or go to Mr. Zingali or another teacher, and then afterwards go up to that person who was bullied and say, "I'm sorry that happened to you. Do you want to talk about it?" Say something caring to that person.
We have reached the end of our time, Clarice, and I just want to say from all of us here at iTech, thank you very much. This is a fascinating story. I know I'm going to be picking up the book as well. And
thank you.
It looks like you sparked some interest in our students and our future generation. So once again,
and Mr. Zingali, if you get some questions, you can just gather them in an email and then I can answer them and then send it back to you and then you can distribute it whichever way you want.
Thank you so much for that, Clarice.
And thank you I'm so honored that you asked me and that you're doing this. I'm so impressed.
Thank you so much.
Okay, bye everybody.